The sound of Miriam Caldwell's stomach growling echoed through the cramped attic room she shared with her 6-year-old daughter Pearl, a harsh reminder that their last meal had been yesterday's thin soup made from potato scraps begged from the kitchen of Willowbrook's only boarding house. It was August 12, 1886, and what should have been the middle of summer prosperity for farming families in Nebraska had become a desperate struggle for survival for a woman whose divorce had stripped away everything she had ever known about security and respectability. The wooden crate sitting in the corner of their miserable lodging contained the only possessions Miriam had managed to salvage from her former life: her late Aunt Cordelia's recipe collection, inheritance that seemed worthless when measured against their immediate need for food, shelter, and basic human dignity in a community that viewed divorced women as moral failures. Miriam's fall from comfortable middle-class wife to destitute outcast had happened with devastating speed when her husband Charles discovered her inability to bear additional children after Pearl's difficult birth. The divorce proceedings had been a public humiliation orchestrated by Charles's expensive lawyer, who painted Miriam as a defective wife who had failed in her fundamental duty to provide sons for her husband's legacy. Nebraska's harsh divorce laws had awarded Charles everything: their house, savings, business interests, and even most of Pearl's belongings, leaving Miriam with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few personal items that Charles deemed too worthless to claim. The scandal had made it impossible for her to find respectable employment in their hometown, forcing her to flee with Pearl to Willowbrook, where nobody knew their shame but where opportunities for divorced women were practically non-existent. The boarding house job that represented their only source of income paid $3 per week for 16 hours of daily labor that left Miriam's hands raw and her body exhausted, while Pearl spent lonely days in their attic room with nothing but a few worn books and her mother's promise that their situation would somehow improve. Mrs. Gertrude Walsh, the boarding house owner, had reluctantly hired Miriam only after extracting promises that she would work twice as hard as other employees to compensate for the moral stain of her divorce, and would never discuss her past with the respectable guests who might be scandalized by associating with a fallen woman. The other employees treated Miriam with suspicion and disdain, whispering about her supposed sins while making it clear that divorced women deserved whatever hardships befell them. Pearl, too young to understand the social complexities that had destroyed their previous life, asked daily when they could go home to their real house and why other children weren't allowed to play with her anymore. Her innocent questions broke Miriam's heart while strengthening her determination to somehow create a better future for the daughter who had become her only reason for continuing to fight against circumstances that seemed designed to crush women who fell outside society's narrow definition of acceptable femininity. Every night, as Pearl slept on their shared cot, Miriam stared at Aunt Cordelia's recipe box and wondered if there might be something valuable hidden among the faded papers, though she couldn't imagine what an eccentric spinster who had lived alone in a one-room cabin could have left that would solve their desperate situation. Aunt Cordelia had been the family outcast during Miriam's childhood, a woman who refused marriage proposals and lived independently on the outskirts of town, supporting herself through mysterious means that generated constant speculation but never seemed to provide more than basic subsistence. The recipes she left behind reflected a lifetime of frugal cooking, detailed instructions for making meals from scraps and wild plants that most people would consider inedible. Miriam had initially dismissed the collection as worthless sentiment, but with their food running out and no money for groceries until her next meager paycheck, she decided to try preparing one of her aunt's survival meals from ingredients she could forage or beg from the boarding house kitchen. The recipe she selected, written in Aunt Cordelia's careful handwriting on yellowed paper, was for something called prosperity stew, a mixture of wild onions, dandelion greens, and whatever meat scraps might be available. Miriam carefully unfolded the yellowed paper containing Aunt Cordelia's recipe for prosperity stew, her fingers trembling with hunger and desperation as she studied the faded ink that represented her only hope for feeding Pearl another meal. The handwriting was more elaborate than she remembered from her aunt's occasional letters, with unusual flourishes and symbols that seemed almost decorative rather than functional, though Miriam attributed this to the loneliness that had driven her eccentric aunt to treat even simple recipes as artistic expressions. As she read through the ingredients list, something caught her attention that made her pause: small marks in the margins that looked like numbers and letters, too deliberate to be accidental ink blots but too cryptic to understand at first glance. "Mama, I'm so hungry," Pearl whispered from their shared cot, her small voice breaking Miriam's concentration as she was reminded of the immediate need that had driven her to examine her aunt's recipes in the first place. At 6 years old, Pearl had already learned not to complain too loudly about their circumstances, understanding instinctively that her mother was doing everything possible to care for her despite their obvious poverty. The sight of her daughter's pale face and too thin frame gave Miriam the motivation she needed to focus on gathering ingredients rather than puzzling over mysterious markings that probably meant nothing anyway. The boarding house kitchen, When Miriam crept down to gather scraps after her official work hours ended, provided most of what she needed for the recipe: wilted onions destined for the garbage, bones from the evening roast that still had bits of meat clinging to them, and access to the small herb garden behind the building where she could collect the wild plants specified in her aunt's instructions. Mrs. Walsh had made it clear that taking food without permission would result in immediate dismissal, but Miriam's desperation outweighed her fear as she carefully selected items that would otherwise be discarded anyway, justifying her actions as salvaging waste rather than stealing. As she prepared the simple stew in a borrowed pot over the small fireplace in their attic room, Miriam found herself studying the recipe more carefully, noticing details that had escaped her initial reading. The margins contained what appeared to be a code, with letters and numbers arranged in patterns that suggested meaning beyond mere decoration. Some of the cooking instructions seemed unnecessarily specific, calling for exact measurements and timing that seemed excessive for a simple survival meal made from scraps and foraged ingredients. Her aunt's notation to stir clockwise 37 times while facing east struck Miriam as peculiar, though she followed the instructions exactly, hoping that Cordelia's eccentricity might somehow improve their meager meal. The stew that resulted from following her aunt's precise instructions was surprisingly flavorful and filling, providing Pearl with the first satisfying meal they had shared in days while giving Miriam enough energy to think clearly about their situation for the first time since arriving in Willowbrook. As they ate together by candlelight, Miriam continued to puzzle over the mysterious markings in the recipe margins, beginning to suspect that her aunt might have embedded some kind of message in what appeared to be simple cooking instructions. The realization that Cordelia had always been more clever and secretive than the family had understood filled Miriam with growing excitement about what other recipes in the collection might contain. After Pearl fell asleep with her stomach finally full, Miriam spread the entire collection of recipes across their small table, examining each page carefully for similar markings and coded messages that might reveal whatever secret her aunt had been hiding during her solitary years. The patterns that emerged as she studied page after page suggested a sophisticated system of notation that transformed cooking instructions into something far more valuable than mere food preparation. Recipe after recipe contained margin notes, unusual measurements, and specific directions that seemed designed to convey information to someone who knew how to interpret the code properly. The recipe, titled Hidden Treasure Pie, made Miriam's pulse quicken as she realized her aunt's choice of names might not have been coincidental. Miriam's hands trembled as she carefully examined the Hidden Treasure Pie recipe, her heart racing with the possibility that her eccentric aunt had embedded crucial information within seemingly innocent cooking instruction. The margin notes for this particular recipe were far more elaborate than the others, containing what appeared to be compass directions, distance measurements, and landmark descriptions that had nothing to do with baking ingredients or oven temperatures. Under the candlelight in their cramped attic room, Miriam began to decode symbols that revealed her aunt's true secret, detailed directions to a location 15 miles northwest of Willowbrook, where something valuable had been carefully hidden away from prying eyes and greedy relatives who had always dismissed Cordelia as a harmless spinster with nothing worth inheriting. The recipe's instructions, when interpreted as a treasure map rather than cooking directions, painted a picture of Aunt Cordelia as a woman far more resourceful and mysterious than anyone in the family had ever imagined. References to mixing ingredients at the old oak split by lightning and baking until the sunrise touches the red rocks were clearly geographical markers rather than culinary guidance, while measurements like 3 cups north from the abandoned well and 2 tablespoons east of the mine shaft entrance provided precise navigation instructions for someone clever enough to understand the code. Miriam realized that her aunt had spent years documenting the location of something extraordinarily valuable while maintaining the perfect disguise of an impoverished woman whose recipe collection would be dismissed as worthless by anyone seeking her assets. The final page of the Hidden Treasure Pie recipe contained the most shocking revelation of all: a detailed inventory written in Cordelia's careful handwriting, listing 12 pounds of finest golden flour and 47 precious sugar crystals, alongside other ingredients that Miriam now understood represented approximately $12 million worth of processed gold or that had been carefully extracted, refined, and hidden over the course of 20 years. Her aunt had apparently discovered and secretly operated a gold mine, using her reputation as an eccentric recluse to deflect attention while systematically removing wealth that she had cached in multiple locations described throughout her recipe collection. The scope of Cordelia's deception and the magnitude of the treasure she had accumulated left Miriam speechless with amazement and hope. Pearl stirred in her sleep as Miriam struggled to process the implications of her discovery, fighting the urge to wake her daughter immediately and share the news that their lives were about to change forever. The practical challenges of claiming her inheritance loomed large in Miriam's mind, as she realized that retrieving the hidden gold would require careful planning, secrecy, and probably assistance from people she could trust not to steal her aunt's legacy. More importantly, she would need to maintain their current circumstances while secretly organizing expeditions to recover treasure that could make them wealthier than anyone in Nebraska, but only if she could locate and transport the gold without arousing suspicion in a community already inclined to view her with hostility. The other recipes in Cordelia's collection, when examined with new understanding, revealed a comprehensive map of treasure locations spread across 3 counties, with each cache documented through cooking instructions that provided exact locations, burial depths, and security measures designed to protect the gold from discovery. Aunt Cordelia had been methodical in her approach to wealth accumulation, spreading her treasure across multiple sites to minimize risk while creating redundant documentation that would allow someone with the complete recipe collection to recover the entire fortune even if individual sites were discovered or disturbed. The woman whom everyone had pitted as a lonely spinster had actually been one of the wealthiest individuals in the territory, choosing poverty as camouflage while building a legacy that would transform her heir's life beyond imagination. As dawn approached and Miriam heard Mrs. Walsh beginning her morning routine downstairs, she carefully returned the recipes to their wooden box, her mind racing with plans for the secret expeditions that would soon liberate them from poverty and social ostracism. The woman who had gone to sleep as a desperate domestic servant struggling to feed her daughter would begin the next day as the secret heir to a fortune that would give them power, security, and the means to build whatever future they chose for themselves. 3 months later, Miriam Caldwell stood in the elegant parlor of Willowbrook's finest mansion, wearing a silk dress that cost more than most families earned in a year, as she graciously accepted congratulations from the same townspeople who had whispered cruel gossip about the divorced woman who had arrived with nothing but shame and a hungry child. The transformation had been carefully orchestrated to appear gradual and legitimate, with Miriam claiming to have discovered valuable mining claims through her deceased aunt's forgotten property records rather than revealing the truth about coded recipes and hidden treasure. Her methodical recovery of Aunt Cordelia's scattered gold caches had yielded exactly the fortune documented in those cryptic cooking instructions, but more importantly had been accomplished without arousing suspicion about the true source of her newfound wealth. The first treasure recovery expedition had taken place on a moonless night in early September, with Miriam following her aunt's precise directions to locate a cache buried beneath the lightning-split oak described in the hidden treasure pie recipe. Working alone with only a borrowed shovel and her desperate courage, she had uncovered a waterproof container holding nearly 2 pounds of refined gold and detailed documentation proving Cordelia's ownership of mineral rights that legally belonged to her heir. Each subsequent expedition, carefully spaced weeks apart and conducted with meticulous attention to secrecy, had revealed additional caches that gradually built Miriam's resources while providing the legal foundation necessary to claim her inheritance without raising questions about its sudden appearance. Pearl, now attending Willowbrook's finest private school and wearing dresses that made her the envy of her former tormentors, had adapted to their changed circumstances with the resilience that had carried her through their darkest months of poverty. The little girl who had once gone to bed hungry now lived in a house with servants, tutors, and every luxury that money could provide, though Miriam was careful to teach her daughter that wealth carried responsibilities as well as privileges. Their new social position had opened doors that had been permanently closed to a divorced woman with nothing to offer, but Miriam never forgot the lessons learned during those desperate weeks when society's judgment had nearly destroyed them both. Miriam's charitable foundation, established to provide assistance for women in desperate circumstances, had become the most respected philanthropic organization in the territory, funded by her aunt's treasure but motivated by her own experience of how quickly respectability could vanish when a woman found herself without male protection or financial resources. The boarding house where she had once scrubbed floors for survival wages now benefited from her anonymous donations, while Mrs. Walsh, who had never suspected that her former employee had become the foundation's primary benefactor, regularly praised the mysterious wealthy patron whose generosity had transformed the establishment into a refuge for women seeking fresh starts rather than mere shelter. The truth about Aunt Cordelia's extraordinary deception had remained Miriam's closely guarded secret, as she understood that revealing the full story would diminish both women's accomplishments by reducing them to mere luck rather than recognizing the intelligence, planning, and courage that had created and preserved such wealth. Cordelia had been a mining pioneer who had discovered and developed valuable claims while using society's dismissive attitude toward spinsters as perfect camouflage for her operations. Her coded recipes represented not just hidden treasure, but a sophisticated system that had protected her legacy until it could reach someone worthy of continuing her unconventional approach to female independence and success. The recipe box that had once represented Miriam's only inheritance now occupied a place of honor in her private study, where she continued to study her aunt's coded instructions not for additional treasure locations, but for the wisdom and inspiration they provided about surviving and thriving in a world that underestimated women's capabilities. The collection had become her most valued possession, not because it had revealed material wealth, but because it had connected her to a remarkable woman whose courage and intelligence had created opportunities that transcended traditional limitations imposed by society's narrow expectations. As Miriam tucked Pearl into bed in their luxurious nursery, surrounded by books, toys, and every comfort that love and money could provide, she often reflected on how Aunt Cordelia's greatest treasure hadn't been the gold itself, but the example of a woman who had refused to accept poverty and powerlessness as her permanent fate. The recipe for true prosperity, Miriam had learned, wasn't hidden in coded instructions but lived in the courage to transform desperate circumstances into opportunities for growth, independence, and ultimately the power to lift others who found themselves facing similar challenges. Thank you for watching this incredible story of hidden treasure, family secrets, and the power of perseverance. If this amazing tale of transformation from poverty to prosperity touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable true stories from the American frontier. What did you think about Aunt Cordelia's brilliant deception and Miriam's incredible discovery? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what other frontier treasure stories you'd like to hear. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our weekly uploads of jaw-dropping historical tales that prove sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places.